Welcome to the Communicators, C-SPAN's weekly program on telecommunications and technology policy. Our guest this week is Kyle McSlarrow, President and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association.
We'd like to welcome back to the Communicators Kyle McSlarrow, the President and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Amy Schatz of the Wall Street Journal, who reports on telecommunications issues and other things for that publication. Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Mr. McSlarrow, as we sit, everybody around the world of telecommunications is talking about Wall Street and finances and things like that. From you being inside the world of telecommunications, particularly cable, how do you look at current day events as far as Wall Street and financials are concerned, and what does that mean for the industry?
Well, I think there's a little bit of an unknown, and I think uncertainty is bad for every industry in that sense. On the other hand, the fundamentals of the business are pretty good and pretty strong, and I think that's been reflected. It's not that our stock prices are being treated any differently from any other industries. They're going up and down with the broader market trends. But I think the issue for our industry, like a lot of people, is going to be what's happening with liquidity and the credit markets. Our deal is going to get done. Our investment's going to get made. It's that kind of question. So I think it's too early. I mean, I think there is, at least for me personally, I think there's a confidence that we'll get through the political part of this and restore confidence and move on. But you know, everybody's watching this. You're absolutely right about that.
And when you say the fundamentals are strong, at least as far as your industry, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think for us, if you look over the last decade, we've had two waves of huge competitors come into the business. First, there was a time when we were the only video offering in America outside of broadcast TV, and the satellite companies came in and took a third of the market. And it was pretty intense competition, and it made us better. And now the telephone companies are offering all the same services cable companies, so high-speed internet, phone, and video offerings. And AT&T and Verizon are pretty formidable competitors. But in the face of that, I think we've gotten stronger and better and more nimble, and we've done okay. I think maybe a little bit to Wall Street's surprise, but you know, that's the fundamentals of the business in terms of how it's doing. But it's not obviously immune to the broader credit issues, liquidity issues.
Amy Schatz.
So one of the things that clearly you're working on now is on the DTV quiet period. As the entire country transitions to digital television, there's an issue at the FCC right now about something called retransmission consent and how long that should last in between. Could you explain this a little bit, folks, about what this issue is and where you guys stand?
Yeah, I mean, just to go backwards a little bit so viewers understand this. Many years ago, Congress said that in order for a cable operator or satellite or telephone company who's providing a signal to the consumer to pass a broadcast signal, so just, you know, ABC, Fox, I mean, the big networks in general, that they had to get consent from the local broadcast station in that marketplace. And by and large, over the last 10, 15 years, has been a rough sort of balance of power, and most of those deals get worked out. More recently, with the digital transition coming, it turns out that a lot of those deals expire at the end of this year, calendar year 2008. The digital transition is 2 months later, February 17th. We're actually working together with broadcasters and other industries to educate the American public about the fact that you've got a transition coming. Here are the tools that are available to you to manage that. And so the issue that's been raised is, would it be better to avoid disputes where if we don't get consent, you actually have to pull down a broadcast signal, which I think will be a shock to most consumers in that short period of time surrounding the digital transition. So it'd be from the end of December through sometime, you know, right after the digital transition. It's before the FCC, it's before Congress. You know, we've had proposals and counter proposals, but nothing's been resolved. My concern is that retransmission consent disputes are going to have one of two unpalatable outcomes. Either broadcasters are going to insist on getting paid a lot more money, which means there are going to be higher rates to consumers, or if they feel strong enough in a particular marketplace, particularly if the Super Bowl or some high-value content's coming up, they're going to yank the signal from a cable operator, and viewers are actually going to lose the signal. And with the digital transition happening and with the enormous amount of cooperation and time and money being spent on the transition, it just seems to me we could defer those disputes. You know, we'll get to them at some point, and we can do that in a way that leaves everybody, including broadcasters, whole. But it just seems to me a little off message to be engaged in those kinds of disputes right around the digital transition.
So broadcasters would argue that this is sort of the first step by NCTA to sort of get rid of retransmission consent and to have some sort of broader reform, because this has been in there for a while. So do they have a point here?
They do have a point. I think they're two distinct issues. One's the digital transition, but I'm also quite public about the fact that we do think retransmission consent regime should be reformed. But they're two distinct issues. We're not going to solve the longer term statutory issue by a quiet period. The quiet period could be short enough. We're talking a couple of months. That's not going to change fundamentally the regime. The regime itself right now is something that was, as I said, set up by Congress in 1992, and it basically ties the hands of any multi-channel video provider and sort of forces them at the broadcaster's choice, either to carry them or to pay more money or to risk losing a signal. And in a competitive marketplace with satellite, telephone, and cable companies all vying for the household, that's an enormous amount of leverage for a local broadcaster who has, by law, exclusive rights. So they have a monopoly on that signal in a market. To withhold and threaten to withhold means you're risking losing customers to one of your competitors. So the trend is operators, whether it's cable or satellite or telephone, are going to end up paying more money to broadcasters, and all of that's going to get passed on to consumers. So that is a legitimate issue, very upfront, that I think that should be looked at and reformed. But the digital transition is a very discrete, very limited solution that I actually have encouraged broadcasters to think about, because my argument to them is actually the reverse, which is if you don't want politicians looking at retransmission consent, you're better off not risking pulling those signals during the digital transition, or else you're going to have a lot of angry constituents calling their members of Congress who are going to be looking at broadcasters wondering why they messed up the digital transition. So my argument is exactly the opposite.
So it goes deeper than the idea that, from your perspective, you want the quiet period to start at the end of this year. Broadcasters, I think, wanted to start next year, early next year, right? About 3 or 4 weeks before the transition date?
The National Association of Broadcasters proposed 2 weeks before the transition, 2 weeks afterwards. And it's more than just a difference of a month. It's actually fundamentally flawed, because if you think about it, if your agreement to carry a signal expires December 31st, and most of them do expire then, it doesn't make any sense that the signal could come off on January 1st and then you're going to wait till February 4th to put it back on. I mean, if you're going to have a quiet period, it should start just before or on the day that the agreements expire. It doesn't have to go very far past the digital transition, but in the run-up to the transition, which is when you're going to have most of the messaging, most of the focus around the country on the digital transition, that's precisely the time that you want to avoid any mixed messages and get people to focus on what they need to do, whether or not it's to buy a digital TV or subscribe to cable or satellite or go buy a converter box and get the coupon program going. I mean, those are the issues people and consumers should be focused on, not whether or not there's a retransmission consent dispute.
Did the FCC open up a comment period on this?
You know, it's not clear exactly where they are. I think our understanding is that they're floating consideration of a quiet period with the other offices, and that they're going to have a short comment period. But I haven't actually seen the item yet, so I'm hopeful that something will be looked at pretty soon. So
I don't think there's any argument in the industry that cable's been on the defensive the last few years with Kevin Martin at the FCC, and obviously, I mean, although he hasn't said it yet, you know, there is an expectation that he's going to step down in the next couple months or maybe early next year. Do you see cable's position then changing? I mean, you've been on defense a lot. Do you at some point switch to offense here and then try to sort of get something on retransmission or something?
I like to think I was on offense the whole time, but you're probably right. Since he's actually the one with the ability to set the agenda at the FCC. I mean, who knows? I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that in the same administration of this president, President Bush, in the first term you had Michael Powell as chairman of the FCC, and in the second term Kevin Martin, and they're two diametrically opposite agendas. So one never knows, regardless of who wins this election, you know, a little over a month from now. But I do think that most of the policymakers, most of the commissioners I talk to, most of the members of Congress I talk to, understand fundamentally that the telecommunications marketplace is radically different from '96, when we passed the last major telecommunications law, and certainly from 1992, which is when they actually passed the last Cable Act. And it's a lot more competitive. There are more services. The internet and the online consumer experience has exploded in ways that people probably didn't foresee and certainly didn't plan for in terms of the rules of the road. So there's a lot to look at. And I do expect that Congress is probably going to play a greater role, not just in terms of the policy, but maybe in terms of oversight of the FCC. It'll take a while probably for the FCC to get up and running in a new administration. They have to go through nominations and confirmations of commissioners. But I think everybody's sort of focused on the same basic food groups of issues, and I feel like we have a great story to tell, as we have really the last couple of years. And, you know, I think it's my job to worry. You know, so I'm never, you know, I probably always a glass half empty guy, so I will continue to worry and continue to position ourselves for whatever comes. But I do like to think that we're playing offense as well as defense.
Do you worry less over McCain or Obama or vice versa presidency?
Well, again, I mean, going back, I mean, I think with the FCC, it's really down to personnel appointments. And as I said with the example with President Bush, it doesn't completely answer the mail just to say who's president. On the other hand, it's clear that there are some fundamental differences between the two candidates, although they haven't talked a lot about telecommunications policy. I mean, it's, you know, for those of us who are in this space, I think it's a little disappointing. I mean, I understand that these are not issues that drive, you know, voters one way or another, but it's a little disappointing that we don't have telecommunications policy higher on the agenda. I feel like we'll be able to work with either administration and anybody who's selected to chair and staff the FCC. I think there are a couple of discrete issues where there are real differences. And interestingly, I think Senator Obama may be a little better on some of the content side of the spectrum. And I probably should point out that I represent not just cable operators, but also 200 program networks. So I have both sides of the business. Whereas Senator McCain, I think, has been more clear that he's very cautious about micromanaging how people operate and run their networks. And, you know, so it's not like you can just pick one and say good and the other one bad. I think it's going to be a mixed bag. And frankly, telecommunications issues in general are not really partisan issues.
One more question. I read earlier this week that the House Oversight and Investigation wrapped up its investigation of the FCC. Any comments or any thoughts? I don't think they've released a report yet, but your thoughts on the nature of the investigation itself?
I actually have no thoughts. I mean, I read the same thing. I've never talked to anybody on the Hill about the investigation. So, you know, basically I'm learning what everybody else is learning, you know, reading the papers.
You said that Obama on the content side was better off than McCain. Can you give an example?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is in some of the speeches, really even before he started running for president, but even since then, I think when it comes to, I mean, there are legitimate concerns about what's appropriate in terms of children viewing content, you know, in the home. And, you know, there's sort of two ways to go about this. One is to change the TV business model or to actually regulate the content, and the other way is to recognize that it's 2008. We are able, in most cases, to solve most challenges with technology, and here too we have technology not around the corner but available today, and that some combination of parental responsibility and parental control and empowering parents to understand what tools are available to them, particularly with set-top boxes, the V-chip, what have you. You don't have to use the government to regulate content to accomplish that goal. I think he's shown a recognition of that. I mean, I'm not going to hang my hat on it. As I say, it hasn't been the real focus of his statements or the campaign, but it has suggested to me an understanding and appreciation that these are not black and white issues, that there really is a huge important role for parents, and we have as providers of television services, we have a responsibility to educate viewers about those tools and provide the tools to parents.
So obviously, you're right, the campaigns don't really talk about this, but on the Communicators, they actually had the representatives from both sides to come on and talk about issues. And when Doug Holtz-Eaton was on for the McCain campaign, we were chatting about him with various things, and one of the things that came up with on cable was the idea of a la carte, which is something that Senator McCain has been very supportive of over the years.
Right.
And Mr. Holtz-Eaton suggested that he would be very supportive of it during a McCain administration. I mean, is that concerning for you, that you might actually have a president in the White House who's paying attention to what's going on at the FCC and actually pushing something like this?
Well, of course, this isn't a complete shock to me. Very well aware where Senator McCain's been. I will say this. It's interesting because he actually had an amendment that we opposed a couple of years ago in the Senate Commerce Committee on this issue. But he's gone to great lengths to also suggest that even though he'd like to see an a la carte world, that he doesn't want it mandated. That's actually a fairly significant point because I'm not sure I'm against an a la carte world if it's not going to be mandated. In other words, if the free market drives in a direction where each of us as consumers has greater and greater control, not just over the selection of networks, which actually is kind of the old way of thinking about this, but over the selection of shows, which is the way I do it when I go to iTunes and download something to watch, I'm all for it. I mean, that's our industry and others are all trying to drive towards something like that, but that's a far different cry from the government coming in and just saying we're going to mandate a one-size-fits-all rule. Worse, we're actually going to impose price regulations on top of that to enforce that rule. I've not ever seen Senator McCain say something like that. So while it's a concern, because I know the history with him on that subject, I think he's also made clear that while he may use the bully pulpit and goad us in a certain direction, I think that's something we can probably live with.
So you were a very early fundraiser for McCain during the campaign, and in those very early days in the primary when it looked really, really bad and everybody else left, you were still there and you were still raising money for him. At this point, would you want to have a role in a McCain administration, or would you want to stay with the cable guys?
Been there and done that. No, and I should just say at the outset, I mean, my wife and I have a personal relationship with Senator McCain, and so that's a personal support. The cable industry has supported lots of candidates, and now we have people supporting Senator Obama as well as Senator McCain. And as we just discussed, I'm not really supporting them on the basis of telecommunications policy, and for me it's other issues that are important personally. But no, I mean, I have no reason to believe that it would be offered, and I'm quite happy representing what I believe is a great industry.
Your industry and others have weighed in over the last few months on something called white spaces. For those who may not understand, just tuning in, what are the white spaces, and what is so important about this that both broadcasters and cable and other entities have weighed in on it so heavily?
Well, it's first of all, I mean, just putting it in the simple terms, I guess, it turns out that our use of the spectrum, for broadcast television, for example, we don't just go from one set of frequencies right into another. There are buffers and white spaces in between them, and largely for historical and regulatory reasons. And in recent years, the conversation has turned to, well, whether or not we now have the technological means to make our use of those white spaces for unlicensed or licensed, portable devices, for example, which could be devices in the home networking, or it could be pretty much anything. There's a coalition of folks who are pushing for the use of the white spaces. They're not all in the same place. Some are pushing sort of a fixed wireless solution, and others are pushing for unlicensed portable devices. And then there are people who've raised concerns. And not all of us are in the same place. In other words, I have no philosophical or policy objection to using white spaces if it can be done in a way that doesn't interfere with other folks' current uses of the spectrum. I'm all for it. That's great. The more we can more efficiently use the spectrum, the better. The problem that's been raised is that, and we're kind of late to this party, is that as the FCC and others have actually tested the use of these devices, it's become clear that there are significant risks that an unlicensed white spaces device would actually cause a television receiver to go dark. And part of the reason is that for cable, there are no white spaces. In other words, the frequencies that are being used in your cable that comes to your home, it is one after another. They're stacked up, and so there's an issue raised there, and then there's an issue raised with broadcast television signals reaching a cable operator at what's called a head end in rural communities, which is where they receive these signals and then pass them on to the households, could be affected by these type of devices. So our position probably is a little different from some of the others. We're not opposed outright to the use of white spaces, but we are saying that the tests and the science have raised significant interference issues. They ought to be addressed. And if they can be addressed in a way that it doesn't affect our consumers, great. But that's where we are today, I think, and we're waiting right now for the FCC, I think, to come out with a report on all the testing. So we'll know a little bit more here in short order.
So turning to another issue that we always have to ask on net neutrality. Obviously, NCTA has been supportive of Comcast in its challenge of the FCC's order that found it was slowing or blocking some customers' traffic. And since that happened, it seemed like there has been sort of a split in the industry because cable and phone, for the most part, on this battle have been side by side sort of fighting this. And after Comcast started fighting the FCC on this, there was some sort of muttering in the telco community that maybe it would have been just a lot better to fall on your sword, take your hits at the FCC, and just let this not get to court, because if the court finds this doesn't, that the FCC wasn't right, that this could actually lead to legal, or it could lead to some legislation. So do you want to respond to some of that?
Well, it's, I mean, I think what you picked up is probably accurate. And I'm always a little dubious when somebody else tells me, hey, why don't you fall on the sword for us and make all this go away? You know, I think this is a tough issue, in part because of just the complex technical issues, you know, surrounding it, in part because I do think that different industries were positioning themselves in different ways. For me, it's very simple. Whether it's a telephone company or a cable company or anybody else, a wireless broadband provider, they ought to have the ability to figure out how to manage a network to the benefit of their consumers. We have a competitive environment. In this world, if you're doing something consumers don't like, and believe me, I read the blogs every day, first thing and throughout the day. I mean, people know it like that, and they are on you. And if you're worrying about your customer base, you got to be worried about how you handle that. That, to me, is a much more effective check than government micromanagement. So when the FCC started going through its enforcement action on whether or not a cable operator could monitor peer-to-peer traffic, which was sucking up an enormous amount of the upstream capacity, and they did so for the benefit of the vast majority of their consumers who weren't engaged in that practice, they were second-guessing a decision that I think that the operator had the right to make. It is true that others viewed this as an opportunity to say, you know what, the FCC's on it. I think they probably had a tactical reason, which is that they thought maybe this is a way to ensure that Congress doesn't pass a statute. Maybe there were other reasons. But I do think that in the absence of any clear rules, and there never has been any clear rules on this, and also just sort of the general policy point of no commission is really equipped to second guess what are very technical and complex management decisions being made by engineers. We're not talking about policy here. We're talking about engineering decisions. That should have been a recipe for caution and humility in terms of what the FCC did. Having now acted, I think the question is, do we let it stand, or do we, as we have, take it to court? And it's not because the outcome is necessarily a bad outcome, because I think everybody's sort of learning as they go, and people are actually changing their practices in real time. But I think the idea that the FCC can just make up these rules on the fly with no advance warning and then do an enforcement action, I just don't think that's the right way to do business. So on that principle alone, we're very supportive of Comcast, but it's not simply about supporting Comcast. I mean, it's supporting an entire industry that has provided broadband to 92% of American households.
Did the FCC decision make moot the congressional efforts on this issue that have been taking place?
I doubt it. I mean, I think there's no reason to believe that those who have pursued a net neutrality bill would be any less likely to pursue it in the next Congress. And, you know, an interesting question is actually, in the face of the FCC action, I mean, it is almost the very definition of arbitrary and capricious. And it makes one wonder whether or not a statute wouldn't be a better option. I'm not prepared to go there at this point, but I have to say it's crossed my mind.
So do you think this is something clearly you're going to be focusing on next year when Congress comes back?
I think, yes, but I think it's because I expect that regardless of who wins the election, I think the issues surrounding broadband adoption, broadband deployment, the investment that goes into broadband, issues like net neutrality are all going to be part of a real focus. You know, my guess is whoever's president, we're going to have the usual, you know, sort of 100 days agenda, and particularly with the economic crisis we have now, all those kinds of issues are going to be at center stage. So I think you'll probably have a lot of hearings, a lot of laying of the predicate, but I think telecommunications will be higher on the agenda in the next Congress than it was the last couple of years, and I think broadband is going to be at the center of that debate. So that will carry with it issues like net neutrality.
It seems like privacy, too, to be another issue.
Yes.
That they're already laying the groundwork for this year, and that next year is going to be even more, and that's a real big issue for a lot of your companies, right?
Yeah, I think, and here I think the good news is, and it's not just us, it's also other network providers, but I think our view is that, you know, in a world where we've all gotten used to sort of the free internet, which is of course free only because it's, you know, we've developed a tremendous advertising model to support it. Internet service providers are only recently starting to look at how they can provide more relevant ads to consumers. And the good news is I think we're keeping right out front. The first step is how do we protect consumers' privacy? How do we ensure that they have the control over what choices are made as we go into that? So to some extent we can learn a little bit from the lessons of the last 15 years as the internet and the online services have developed.
As terms of technology go, many households have video on demand, many households have DVRs, almost become a ubiquitous term, and as what people know it. Technology-wise, where does the cable industry go as far as consumer use is concerned?
On the video side, you know, I think the holy grail for us, I think to some extent, is achieving, and we're on our way but not there yet, is achieving a world where people can go into a store and buy a flat screen, bring it home, and have it operate with one remote and no set-top box. Have all the functionality built into that TV or built into the network. And I know as a consumer myself, I would, you know, I'm longing for that day. And I think over the last couple of years there have been fits and starts to get there, but I think for the first time this year, we and a bunch of consumer electronics manufacturers agreed on a platform that will allow us, it's called True Two-Way, that will allow us to move in that direction. And so I think ease of use, simplicity, and cleaning up the clutter, those are all great things for consumers, but the other great thing about it is that for the first time, the interactive nature of the internet starts to spill over into the video space. And you mentioned video on demand, and that's sort of the early version of interactivity. But there's a whole lot more behind it. And my guess is the direction we're going is, even though it won't be complete, it won't be a replacement for the internet, but I think you will see internet-like functionality for consumers. Your ability to search on a TV, to have all kinds of interactive applications. You know, it'll start with games, but it'll morph into something else. And I think whether or not it's your PC or your laptop or a television receiver, I think that kind of interactivity is going to be throughout the home, and that's the direction we want to go.
Do you think there's ever going to be a time, though, when you can just literally just plug your internet cable into your set-top box or into your TV
Sure.
and just actually surf the internet without having to go through this walled garden like...
Sure, you can do it now.
Well,
you can do it now. You've got
not very
sure.
easily. I mean,
sure. You've got the ports are on the televisions now. This True Two-Way standard. I mean, it's up to the manufacturers to choose to put the inputs. But the true two-way standard, which we developed in concert with the consumer manufacturers and chip manufacturers, the specifications allow that kind of input. I think it's a different issue whether or not somebody should go, I mean, we provide a service, and so if somebody signs up for it, they pay for it, they're getting a service. Someone else shouldn't be able to monkey with our service, right, and rejigger it. I mean, you're paying for a particular service, you should get it. But we've all along said we would be delighted if people have the ability to shift content from the internet one way or from their own personal devices and hook it into the television. And by the way, it goes the other direction. We're also, and have this deployed today, particularly with Windows Media, you have the ability to show a cable service on the PC. And we want that to be two-way as well. So I think our view is, as broadband providers, is the more we can get consumers happy that the broadband experience can inform everything they're doing, the better. So we don't look at this as just video providers. I think broadband is really the driver here for the business.
Our guest this week on the Communicators has been Kyle McSlarrow, the president and CEO of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. Also helping us with the interviewing, Amy Schatz of the Wall Street Journal. To both of you, thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Our coverage of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial continues tonight at 8. Lincoln scholars Michael Beschloss, Joshua Wolf Schenck, James Swanson, and presidential historian Richard Norton Smith discuss the character of Lincoln, the forces that shaped him, the influence of his melancholy temperament on his presidency, and the myths surrounding his death. Abraham Lincoln, the President and the Man, tonight at 8 on C-SPAN. And be sure to visit our website, cspan.org/Lincoln, for the largest Lincoln video archive on the Internet, and a spotlight on Lincoln featuring the design for the new Lincoln pennies. cspan.org/Lincoln. C-SPAN, the network of the Lincoln Bicentennial.
The second presidential debate between Republican nominee John McCain and Democratic nominee Barack Obama will be Tuesday at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. NBC's Tom Brokaw will moderate the town hall format with questions from the audience and from the Internet. Our live coverage begins with a preview at 7 p.m., followed by the debate, and then we'll take your calls and comments. We'll also have statements from the post-debate spin room. That's live Tuesday on C-SPAN.
This is C-SPAN's America and the Courts. Next, a discussion of the 2008 election and what impact the next president will have on the Supreme Court. The Bill of Rights Institute and the William & Mary Law School hosted this discussion on September 26th in Williamsburg, Virginia.
We're here tonight to talk about the Supreme Court and the election. Contrary to what some of you might have thought, we didn't consider suspending or postponing this session tonight to focus on the Wall Street bailout.
Speak for yourself.
I was going to suggest that we all get together in small groups and sort of chip in some money, pool some money to buy up some worthless mortgage-backed securities in order to bolster confidence in our nation's financial system. But that's a subject for another program. This one couldn't be more timely. Talking about the Supreme Court and the election. I don't want to go too far out on a limb, but I think it's correct to say that on November 4th, John McCain or Barack Obama will be elected President of the United States. If it's very close, it may take a few more days. And you know, the Supreme Court is so closely divided on so many big issues that changing one justice can change the court. And you know the issues: abortion, the death penalty, race, religion, gay rights, gun rights, the reach of presidential power. And so it is the case that we don't know, of course, if any justice is going to step down or when, we can say John Stevens is 88 years old, very sharp, remarkably fit, but it would be quite remarkable if he were still on the court 4 years from now at age 92 and a half. We have several justices who are in their early to mid-70s. Ruth Ginsburg is 75. If the president who's elected in November serves 2 terms, there's a good chance that president will replace her as well. So we're here to talk about the stakes for the Supreme Court in this election. I do think it's fair to say that McCain and Obama have not said much about the Supreme Court, but what they've said, you know, they have quite different views on the matter. McCain has said his favorite justices are John Roberts, Sam Alito. He's mentioned Scalia and Thomas. It is interesting he's picked the 4 that are most skeptical about the McCain-Feingold Act. Barack Obama is somebody who taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago for 8 or 9 years. He knows the subjects very well. I'm interested in what he's not said. I've looked at some of the clips, and he's occasionally mentioned, when asked, his favorite justices are something like Breyer, Ginsburg, David Souter. He said they're reasonable people. You guys should correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't believe he's invoked Thurgood Marshall. It was the case before that John Kerry or Al Gore would always mention Thurgood Marshall, and I don't know what to take from that. Perhaps you guys can read something into what Barack Obama is thinking about the Supreme Court. So anyway, I'd like each person to sort of talk on this panel. We've got a fine panel to sort of talk about what they see as the stakes. How will the Supreme Court be different 5 years out, depending on whether McCain or Obama is elected? I'm going to just quickly introduce the panelists because I think you probably know most of them or all of them. Walter Dellinger was a former Solicitor General in the Clinton administration, a Duke law professor, a lawyer at O'Melveny and Myers in Washington now. John McGinnis is a law professor at Northwestern, served in the Justice Department in the Reagan administration. Miguel Estrada is a Washington lawyer, had worked at the Solicitor General's office, had firsthand experience with how unpleasant the confirmation process can be. He was nominated for the U.S. Court of Appeals. He also has a distinction is that he's the husband of one of our favorite people at the Supreme Court. Patricia McCabe Estrada works in the Public Information Office with Kathy Arberg. And finally, Ted Shaw, who was for a long time the general counsel, the director counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York, the position that essentially Thurgood Marshall made famous. So as I say, I'd like each person to sort of talk a few minutes about their view of the stakes in this presidential election for the Supreme Court. And John, I think you said you'd like to go first.
I'm happy to go first because I'm actually going to not so much talk about the issues as what are the constraints, who's more likely to be able to reshape the Supreme Court. Let's assume, for purposes which I'm sure will be refined through our discussion, that McCain would like to appoint someone that looks a bit like Alito and Roberts, and that Obama would like to appoint someone who looks a bit like Breyer and Ginsburg. Let's assume that, at least in the way they vote. Well, who's more likely to be able to shape and really make a difference in the Supreme Court? And my 4 points, and talking about the shape and what the stakes are, really can be summarized all by numbers. My first number is 56 to 58, and that's the number likely of Democratic. That's the likely number of Democratic senators, and that really shapes the battlefield of Supreme Court nominations. That obviously suggests that Obama, in that respect, has the upper hand in reshaping the Supreme Court. Indeed, I think it's even perhaps worse than one thinks about it, in the sense that for McCain, in the sense that the Democrats at least have shown willingness to use the filibuster. So what's crucial is he has to please the 40th most liberal senator, and that will move his nominations to the left. Now, there's some things he can do about that. There are trade-offs, maybe using ethnicity and things that will draw people to vote for his nominees. So I might predict in a McCain presidency we might see an Hispanic nominee, so he can get a little closer to his what political scientists would call his ideological ideal point, because some people will vote for the first Hispanic will be wary of not voting on that ground. So, but that's the first number. The second number is, I think we would call 73.5 and 61, or 12.5, and that's the difference in the average age of the conservative and liberal justices. And of course, that's a real advantage to McCain, because other things being equal, non-voluntary departures from the court, there are more likely to be non-voluntary departures from the court for